الان تست میکنم. 1 2 3 میشنوین محمد؟ شریک گرفتی؟ محمد من الان دارم صحبت میکنم، 1 2 3 میگم، میگیری؟ یا 1 2 3 1 2 3.
The subcommittee will come to order. Without leave or without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitation in the rules. The Middle East is a complex place. Major players weave an intricate web of support and opposition. As you can see on the screen, that is on each end of the committee room, and Ambassador, I think there may be a chart that you have been furnished as well. It's hard to keep track of who supports what groups, but one thing is clear: nobody seems to like ISIS. Yet, despite everyone being against ISIS, we're not winning the battle against the war on ISIS. One of the reasons, I believe, is because it's not clear we understand the group very well. This time we call it like it is. ISIS is a radical Islamic terrorist group. The White House doesn't really like to talk about this, but we cannot defeat ISIS if we do not understand who they are. It is critical that we know what its goals are, how it seeks to achieve those goals. Even if the White House doesn't think ISIS is Islamic, ISIS does. ISIS explains its actions and justifies them through its interpretation of the Islamic law and Islamic writings. This philosophy is reflected in its daily actions and its deadly actions. ISIS beliefs state that Christians either must renounce their faith or embrace Islam or die. It is no coincidence, then, that we have seen ISIS specifically target Christians, not because Christians are stealing their jobs or fighting against ISIS, but merely because they are Christians. ISIS attempts to rid Iraq of Christians that have been in Iraq since the earliest times of Christianity. The 21 Egyptians beheaded by ISIS in Libya were killed because they were Christians. Christian towns across Syria have been destroyed by ISIS. Last Sunday, ISIS released a new video of them killing Christians, this time Christians in Ethiopia. ISIS persecution of Christians is not letting up because its beliefs have not changed. This evil belief is what attracts many to join ISIS. 2 days ago, 6 men from Minnesota were arrested for being recruited to the ISIS cause. Reports indicate that there is no recruiting mastermind behind their conversation, just the belief of sharing illicit beliefs. There are dozens more examples. Teenagers, women, and fighting-age males all are heeding the call from ISIS. The main way these recruits hear the call from ISIS is through social media. I've been raising the issue of terrorist use of social media since 2010, when I sent a letter to YouTube asking them to change the reporting function for terrorist content. More recently, the subcommittee held a hearing that highlighted how Twitter has exploded with ISIS propaganda and recruitment efforts. ISIS uses Twitter to broadcast its acts to the world. Twitter can do a better job policing its platform to stop terrorists from using it, but I was happy to see that after our hearing, Twitter took down 12,000 ISIS accounts and updated its rules so that even promoting terrorism is a violation. Time will tell if these new rules are enforced. We cannot shut down ISIS's messaging. We must also counter it. To recognize that ISIS justifies its actions with Islamic verses does not mean we are at war with Islam. That is too simplistic and not realistic. According to ISIS ideals, it also thinks the roughly 200 million Shia around the world should also die. Same with the heads of state of every Muslim country that has elevated man-made law above Sharia law. What we need is a deeper understanding of what ISIS believes and to use this understanding to defeat ISIS and its philosophy. For example, if we had a better idea of ISIS philosophy, then we would better understand why people join this group. This will in turn give us ways to stem the flow of foreign fighters going to this terrorist group. Another example, if we know ISIS legitimacy is based upon establishing a caliphate that must control territory, then perhaps seizing territory from ISIS becomes a higher priority by fighting them. There are many other possible benefits of having a better understanding of ISIS philosophy. Finally, we need the voices of Islam who disagree with ISIS' interpretation of Islam to come and speak out against ISIS. We need to find new ways to work with local imams, prominent, well-respected Islamic scholars, and like-minded NGOs here at home and abroad to get their voices heard in the Muslim world. I think we should work with our allies to expose ISIS half-truths and show it for the charlatan that it is. ISIS has used its ideals to recruit and kill. It's time we now use and find out what that ideology is and use against them. I now yield to the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, for conducting today's hearing. Understanding ISIS, ISIL, Daesh's ideology, how this ideology informs ISIL's goal and actions, and what are the implications for the United States and its allies in countering ISIL are issues that merit serious discussion. As a ranking member on this subcommittee and a member of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, I've engaged on ISIL from two perspectives. On one hand, from our efforts to counter ISIL abroad in the Middle East, and on the other hand, from our work to prevent terrorist acts and the flow of freedom fighters here at home. ISIL is a unique threat, and although it rose out of the group commonly known as al-Qaeda in Iraq, its objectives and tactics differ significantly from those of al-Qaeda. Even compared to other terrorist organizations, ISIL's tactics are especially and deliberately savage. ISIL's atrocities against its captives and religious minorities living in the territory controlled by ISIS is horrific. Even compared to other terrorist organizations, ISIL's tactics are especially of concern to us. It's brutal, intolerant, and intolerance for other faiths, invokes its ideology to justify practices including murder, slavery, and the destruction of ancient artifacts in Iraq and Syria. But ISIL's actions are also hypocritical, for while it destroys certain pre-Islamic statues and cultural objects in the name of its ideology, it's also known to traffic in these sorts of antiquities to finance its terrorist operations. Indeed, ISIL's members are not exclusively ideologues. Instead, I see ISIL as being made of, at least loosely, as three loose factions. True ideologues who have an apocalyptic version of Islam, old pro-Saddam military and intelligence officers, and foreign fighters from around the world. Some of these foreign fighters are hardened fighters, but many are just what the uncle of Tamerlan Tsarnaev called his nephew, one of the Boston Marathon bombers, a loser, misguided adventure seekers, and young men and women who joined ISIL for some sense of power and purpose they otherwise lack. To degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL, we'll have to cut off its supply of money and manpower. Specifically, we need to work with our allies to improve our efforts to prevent the flow of foreign fighters to Iraq and Syria. We also need to do a better job of countering ISIL's messaging to potential recruits and responding to ISIL's savvy using social media. We need to counter their communication smartly and not in a heavy-handed way that would give them legitimacy that they, frankly, do not deserve. Further, we need to assist our allies in the region, particularly Jordan and Iraq, in containing and rolling back the territorial gains made by ISIL. For unlike al-Qaeda, ISIL still needs to control territory in order to survive. It's my hope that today's hearing will provide some insights and constructive proposals on how the United States and its allies can enhance their efforts to counter ISIL. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The Chair will now recognize members who wish to give an opening statement for 1 minute. I'd ask members to keep their statements to 1 minute. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you again, Ambassador. Seems like the only time we meet in safe ground is here. Otherwise, your career has been in all the places that are at the center of this discussion today, and I appreciate your being here, certainly as someone who understands the issues and the people with a level of detail that is not, even in the Near East, is not always understood. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I certainly think understanding where we must learn not to tolerate the intolerance that leads to ISIS, or for that matter, the intolerance that has led to other terrorist organizations, which I think you've done a wonderful job of showing most of them on your diagram that's before us. So again, Ambassador, I look forward to a lively debate on all the steps that could be taken, most of which, if they've been taken, have failed, and if they haven't been taken, the question today will be why not? And I thank you and yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The Chair recognizes the other gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for his opening statement.
I want to commend the Chair and the Ranking Member for their excellent selection of witnesses. One witness is particularly controversial, and that's because that witness represents an organization that was formerly on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. Formerly. The Japanese government in times past carried out horrific actions, particularly against American POWs. That was then. Today, we honored the Prime Minister of Japan. The Prime Minister was here today to promote a trade agreement that includes Vietnam, formerly an enemy of the United States. The executive branch has treated as terrorists the IRA, Sinn Féin, the African National Congress at various times. Formerly is formerly. Second, the MEK, unlike the vast majority of witnesses, present company accepted, has actually provided Congress with startlingly interesting and useful information, such as the existence of the Natanz nuclear facility. Third, we're told that Ms. Rajavi has greater expertise on Iran than on ISIS. If we had one witness pull out every time that witness thought that the core expertise of a fellow witness was in an area on a related issue and not the explicit subject of the hearing, we would have an awful lot of empty chairs. And finally, the press has attacked the inclusion of the MEK in this hearing because although the MEK has provided incredibly useful information, they tend to provide information that furthers their public policy interest. Been here almost 20 years, heard about 16,000 witnesses. I've never heard a witness that wasn't providing information to further their public policy interest. So I look forward to hearing the witnesses here and commend you on your selection. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Obama declared his intention to defeat ISIS and developed a plan he believes can achieve his aims. However, I have serious concerns with the strategy, and I use the term loosely, especially because the President doesn't seem to have a clear understanding of our enemy. In the past year, President Obama has referred to ISIS as not Islamic and as al-Qaeda's JV team, statements that cause confusion about the group and may have contributed to significant strategic errors. Denying that the U.S. is at war with radical Islam makes it difficult to engage in a factual, honest, ideological debate exposing ISIS's false narrative and to empower moderate Muslim voices. Misperceptions and the lack of understanding about ISIS have consistently led to underestimating this rapidly expanding terror group. The reality is that ISIS is very Islamic, even if its interpretation of Islam differs from the majority of Muslims around the world, which is exactly why we should identify the enemy as what it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. The understanding of ISIS's origins, motivations, and ideology are of critical importance in our bid to defeat this brutal terrorist group. ISIS's Salafi jihadist ideology is not unique among terrorist organizations. However, its brutal exploits, proficient use of social media, expansive territorial control, and commitment to a pre-modern form of governance constitute a dangerous evolution that set it apart from its predecessors. While ISIS's reliance on territorial control and governance makes it a uniquely serious threat for the United States and our partners, these attributes also represent serious vulnerability. ISIS forces can be targeted more easily, and if it continues to lose territory or its ability to govern, it will have lost much of its legitimacy. I look forward to the discussion of today's witnesses, and with that, I'll yield back.
Chair recognizes the other gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. You can't defeat an enemy that you're not willing to define accurately. The President, in September of 2014, outlined a strategy to defeat ISIS. That strategy needs to evolve. In that strategy, that speech, he said that he was not going to have any boots on the ground. It was going to be a different strategy than past wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the same exact speech, he announced that he was sending 495 additional troops to Iraq. Here, when Secretary Kerry was before the Foreign Affairs Committee hearing recently, he said that there would be no offensive action. even though right now we're engaged in kinetic airstrikes. He later clarified, we still have unanswered questions as far as what kind of flexibility and resources are going to be given to that commander in the ground to actually accomplish the mission. We're relying on Iraqi military and law enforcement to finish the job in destroying ISIS. Many of them don't even show up to work. Many of the Syrian rebels that we're relying on Syria aren't fighting ISIS. They're going after Assad, which wouldn't be such a bad thing if we took him out. The strategy needs to evolve. I look forward to this hearing today to bring some more accountability, not only to defining the enemy, but destroying them.
Without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. Ask that the witnesses keep their presentation to approximately 5 minutes. I'll introduce the first panel. Ambassador Robert Ford finished his 30-year career with the Peace Corps and the U.S. Department of State in April of 2014, and now a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Ambassador Ford has served the United States nobly in a lot of places that have conflict, such as Algeria, Syria, and Iraq. Dr. Walid Faris, who is scheduled to testify here on the panel, is still on a plane from New York to here. So when he gets to Dulles, we will be notified, but we will proceed with Ambassador Ford and your testimony at this time. Thank you, Ambassador. Your statement will be made part of the record.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, thank you for your invitation today. It's an honor to be here to talk about the Islamic State, which is one of the biggest foreign challenges that our country and our military confronts today. I've laid out in my written testimony some more detailed thoughts about the ideology of the Islamic State and what an understanding of that ideology would suggest in terms of our own strategies. So in my oral testimony, let me just highlight a few key points. Number one, the Islamic State's ideology comes out of a Salafi jihadi school, as Congressman Higgins just noted. It allows for no compromise on key elements of doctrine and practice. Let me underline that. It allows for no compromise on key elements of doctrine and practice. According to its ideology, compromise in applying divine instruction is sin, and an adherent would not want to die with that sin weighing against him. Number two, because ultimately the Islamic State rejects compromise, it also rejects pluralism, and it even rejects things like borders between states and foreign governments. Three, in policy terms, this means that the Islamic State itself thinks that it must fight communities who reject its rule. It cannot compromise with communities that reject its rule. It would be a sin for its leaders and its adherents to make such a compromise. So what that means is that Iran and the Shia may be the Islamic State's greatest immediate enemy, but we need to understand that the Islamic State also sees us as an eventual, if not an immediate enemy. It views us as an enemy to the application of its literalist interpretation of divine law across the planet. The Islamic State's ideology also creates some weaknesses that we should seek to exploit. First, its severe, literalist interpretation of governance and justice alienates a great many inhabitants of territories it controls. We've seen this, for example, in Syria and Iraq. There will be local populations in these countries with whom we can make common cause against the Islamic State. Number two, secondly, this is especially true with other armed opposition groups in Syria. Those opposition groups have fought the Islamic State on the ground. I want to repeat that. Those opposition groups have fought the Islamic State on the ground for the past 16 months. Some of them are also Salafis. The Islamic State has killed scores of Salafi fighters from other groups because those other groups refused to acknowledge the Islamic State's authority. Remember what I said, it accepts no compromise. What that also means in practical terms is that if the Assad regime in Syria were to fall, which is an event that I judge highly unlikely anytime soon, the Islamic State would not, let me repeat, the Islamic State would not take control in Damascus. Rather, other Syrian opposition groups, like Antibodies, would rush to fight against it even harder. We should be helping anti-extremist Syrian fighters the same way we are helping the Iraqi army. 3, we should not fall into the trap, and I have seen this discussed in some policy circles here in Washington, should not fall into the trap of thinking that working with Iran will help fix our Islamic State problem. The Islamic State arose in part, not entirely, but in part, from long-standing grievances and fears within Sunni communities in the Levant and Iraq about growing Persian and Shia influence. Working with Iran, even indirectly, will feed the Islamic State narrative and will immediately help its recruiting. Lastly, the Islamic State's declaration of a caliphate was quite controversial within Salafi jihadi circles. Its claim to legitimacy and allegiance depends on its control of land and its ability to apply its interpretation of Sharia, of Islamic law. Were it not to control land, were it not to be able to govern, its claim to legitimacy within those Salafi jihadi circles would be undermined. And therefore, seizing ground, not just airstrikes, but seizing ground needs to be an important part of our strategy. Mr. Chairman, let me conclude there, and I look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador, for succinctly outlining the issue before us. What is the doctrine of ISIS? You mentioned that there were 2 issues. They won't compromise. Compromise is sin. What's the doctrine?
The Islamic State's leadership and its adherents, the ones that are ideologically driven, and I rush to add here, Mr. Chairman, that not everyone that fights under the banner of the Islamic State is probably ideologically driven. I think a great many, especially in Syria, are driven by more mundane things like salaries and access to food and war supplies. But for the ideologically driven among them, their goal is to apply their interpretation, emphasize that, their interpretation of divine law, Sharia, on the planet. And they, because they do not accept borders, any borders, they believe that it's to be applied universally to all mankind. And those who resist must, in the end, submit and either submit or be killed.
Submit or die.
Right. Now, can I add one thing on this? I have seen a great deal of discussion about the Islamic State and Christians. The doctrine is that Christians must either convert or submit, and submit in this case means pay taxes, which in Islamic law is called jizya, or they face death too. So it's convert, pay the tax, or they can leave, they can go somewhere else, or they will be killed.
Convert, pay your taxes, or die.
Or leave, yeah.
Or leave.
So what I saw, for example, people who claim to be from the Islamic State in Libya, where they murdered the Egyptian Coptic Christians and then the Ethiopian Christians, I think that falls well outside even the Islamic State's interpretation. For example, in Syria, they allowed Christians to stay, but they insisted that they pay that tax, the jizya.
Let me move on to some other comments that you made. Their leadership, let's use them. And I understand people are joining ISIS for different reasons. They're not all united on the reason that they're there. But it's their interpretation of what they see as divine law that drives their process of doctrine and then drives their process of compromise or refusing to compromise. I'll talk about the compromise part. That means compromise with anybody else. Is that correct? Let's say other Muslim beliefs, other Muslim philosophies about religion or the Quran.
Correct. They believe that their interpretation is the only valid one, and that is why even other Salafis, they have murdered scores and scores of them in places like Syria. They are by far the most extreme, which is why in a place like Syria, Mr. Chairman, you have some Salafis fighting other Salafis.
A couple more questions with my time remaining. One thing that you mentioned that makes them different than all these other terrorist groups that are listed on this chart, and you need a flow chart to keep up with them in the whole world.
That is quite a chart, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you can keep it. There's no pride of authorship. Is that they control and desire to control land, unlike Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, who hide in caves and run out and do mischief, and they run back to their caves. ISIS is up front. They want to control swaths, big areas, and get bigger to have a caliphate, and they're in Syria, Iraq, and moving in different directions. Is that what makes them different than other terrorist organizations?
That is one of the most distinguishing features of the Islamic State, is this drive, this insistence by the Islamic State to actually create a governing entity, and not just a terrorist entity, but a real live governing organization with a bureaucracy, with a military that collects taxes, that operates court systems openly. That's what's different. And their declaration of that, Mr. Chairman, was quite controversial within Salafi jihadi circles. A lot of other Salafis said it is not time, it's premature, or they said you don't actually control the land and you won't be able to do it, and so you're full of baloney. And others said your doing so will simply increase divisions among the Salafis, and therefore it is unwise. So that's a point of vulnerability, that declaration of the caliphate, this issue of controlling land, that is a real vulnerability within their own school of Salafi jihad Islam.
I'll try to get two quick questions, maybe quick answers back. How big is ISIS, number-wise?
In terms of total numbers of people that live under its control, happily or unhappily, probably a couple of million. Right. Between the big cities in Iraq that are under its control are Fallujah and Mosul, probably have a population of 1.5 to 2 million. And then on the Syrian side, maybe another million.
And ISIS has made it clear by their actions and their beliefs and their rhetoric, Iran is an enemy of ISIS because of their different doctrine philosophies, the Iranian government. And you mentioned would it be foolish for the United States to try to side with Iran trying to fight ISIS? Is that what you were saying?
Exactly. That plays into their efforts to recruit by saying there's an American-Iranian conspiracy to put down the Sunnis, and we're the ones fighting it.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Massachusetts.
I like Mr. Massachusetts. That's not bad. It makes me sound like some kind of bodybuilder.
I called you something different last week, if you remember. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Texas. I just want to deal with the issue initially of foreign fighters. There's some written reports, I'll only go that far in commenting on, there might be as many as 22,000 upwards in terms of foreign fighters. And they're the people that are putting in the front line many times for suicide attacks and the most vicious attacks in that regard. So a couple of things. Number one, Turkey has shown some initial hesitancy, at least, in working to degrade and defeat ISIL. Foreign fighters continue to pass through Turkey. What can the United States and its allies do to further engage Turkey? And what more can Turkey do to guard its border so that they can be used as a conduit for these foreign fighters as much as they have been?
Congressman, the Turks do have a border problem, and it's causing problems for us too. They need more manpower along that border because these are, let's be frank, they're ancient smuggling routes. There are lots of little goat paths. There are lots of little donkey paths that have been there for centuries. and they need to be shut down. There is not a fence along the entire 500-mile Syrian-Turkish border, and there's not a fence along the Iraq-Turkish border either. So it's a question of devoting more resources. The Turks have also asked for greater cooperation in terms of sharing of names of extremists moving around. I think that will help, but that is not sufficient. There is a strong need for actual control, physical control of the border. The other thing I would just say, and I think this is really important, I was in Turkey recently, in end of January, beginning of February. The Turks have real doubts about the utility of a policy that focuses on combating the Islamic State without also dealing with and removing the Bashar al-Assad government, which they believe fuels the recruitment to the Islamic State. Their argument would be something like this. You can bomb and kill 50 of them, and they'll recruit 45, 48, or 50 the next day because they want to fight Bashar al-Assad. So the strategy that the American administration has laid out in the Turkish view is inadequate.
I see. Also, just looking at our European allies in this regard, what can they do that they're not doing now to help stem the flow of foreign fighters?
A couple of comments on that. First, I think there are many of our European friends are genuinely concerned about the size of the foreign fighter flow. You mentioned a 22,000 number. I've seen numbers like that. I know, for example, that the French and the Belgians are exceptionally concerned about the numbers of their citizens that are going. And so it's, in a sense, you have to deal with it on two levels. One is just a pure intelligence and security effort to block movements, whether they be out of Europe or coming back into Europe. And then the second is they need people within the Muslim communities of those countries themselves to be explaining to potential recruits why joining the Islamic State is not only wrong morally, but will also land them in serious trouble.
Yeah, other groups also, including affiliates in Afghanistan, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, as well as Boko Haram in Nigeria, have significantly pledged to ISIL as well. And what are the operational financial relationships between these organizations, and do ISIL leaders exert command and control in any way over these groups?
There have been lots of little Salafi splinter groups that have announced their allegiance to the Islamic State, although some others have pointedly declined to do so in places like Algeria. The two big ones that have pledged allegiance are in Libya and in the Sinai Peninsula. Those are the two most serious. On the Libya side, I am not aware that there's much command and control. I rather doubt that. But there certainly has been some sharing of information in terms of how to use social media and how to do filming. If you saw, for example, that terrible film where the Egyptian Christians were marched onto the beach and then murdered, that bore a very frightening resemblance to videos that have come out of places like Iraq and Syria, and the same in Sinai. So there certainly are some kinds of links, but I don't know if it extends to command and control. With respect to financial, Congressman, I just can't say one way or the other. I don't know.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, bios are a wonderful thing, especially when they link us back to the early days of the Afghan initiative after 9/11. At that time, the then Bush administration was focused on Afghanistan, the Taliban supporting al-Qaeda. We've certainly morphed a long way during the second half of your career and my entire career in Congress together. Today, that complex chart that I'll hold up one more time and say it isn't nearly complex enough for the problem.
I hope there's not a test on that chart later.
Well, if there's a whole bunch of lines that should go both ways for oppose, too. But before we modify that, Ambassador, we were overly simplistic in 2001 when we viewed the Middle East. At that point, you were halfway through your career. You were an expert in Near East, Middle East, a little bit of Africa. For now today, we're a little more aware of the complexity. We understand the real struggles between various power groups, the former Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and they're not wanting to acquiesce to other powers. Obviously, Persian expansion to regain their historic position. Saudi Arabia's control of Mecca and Medina. I'm not trying to give a lecture here. I'll bring this to a close. And these odd alliances that often, you explained caliphates and you explained it, but of course, the idea that a Alawite minority in Syria, somewhat Shia in its nature, could dominate the area and, in fact, support both Shia and Sunni operations against Israel is longstanding and has been ignored. So what I want to do is, in the limited time after this little diatribe of history, is ask you specifically, Syria seems to be one of our most complex areas. We know that everybody in Syria either is or could be on the wrong side, because we obviously know that Assad is aligned with Iran. We know that many of the Sunnis are involved with ISIS. And as you said, there's a real question about what after Assad. So let me just go through 2 or 3 quick points, and you can take as much time as the chairman will give you afterwards. The potential outcome if Assad falls is one area, because although he has shown a resilience, it's not a forever situation in any of these countries. Secondly, the effects of a no-fly zone, both on the long-term strategy of, if you will, bringing peace of some sort to Syria, whether with or without Assad leaving, and its effect on refugees. And then the last one, which is the one I alluded to in this long question, how would you suggest we find and define and be comfortable in what the administration calls the, if you will, the moderate Free Syrian Army forces? How do you find those groups when there seem to be more people in the 2 other groups that we say we oppose? And thanks for taking notes on that. If there's time left, we'll go to Yemen.
I think Syria is just the hardest nut. It's just the hardest nut to crack. Very tough. With respect to your questions, I think it's very unlikely, as I said, that Assad's regime is going to collapse tomorrow or the next day. It is getting weaker, but I don't think it's about to collapse. But if we stretch out this, where it's going in this long, horrible war of attrition, were the regime to finally be worn down, what you would have is you would just have more groups fighting for control of the capital, and you might end up with a situation where different opposition groups control different neighborhoods of Damascus.
Well,
the Islamic State might control some,
right,
but they wouldn't control it all.
And in that vein, what would be the effects on Christians, a rather large minority in the region, since Assad is effectively the protectorate of Christians?
Well, I wouldn't call Bashar al-Assad the protector of the Christians. He likes to call himself that, but his forces have bombed plenty of churches too.
Sure.
So the effect on Christians, like the effect on all Syrians, would be really bad because the fighting would just get worse. We'll have a huge surge of refugees out of Damascus. So,
which brings us to the other 2 points, the no-fly zone and where do you find moderates?
Yeah. With respect to the no-fly zone, this is a tough one. Where I am on this now, Congressman, is a no-fly zone could help, but not just without thought and a strategy. The no-fly zone, we had a no-fly zone in Iraq, and it lasted 12 years, and it only ended when U.S. troops went into Baghdad. So I don't think we want to do another 12-year no-fly zone over Syria. So the real question is, can you use a no-fly zone to get to the political settlement that we want? And that requires then that in return for our doing a no-fly zone, the opposition, the Syrian opposition, is going to reach out to elements that now support the Assad regime and say, hey, there's a third choice. It doesn't have to be the Islamic State or Assad. There's a moderate third choice. Work with us on that. I have to be honest, I don't think the Syrian opposition has done a very good job of that. And the other part of that is, if we're going to do it, the quid pro quo really needs to be from the Turks. You will put the resources on that border and shut it down so that we don't have Islamic State and Al-Qaeda elements moving back and forth over the border to get food, to get medical care, to travel, whatever it is. So we should, if we're going to do a no-fly zone, Congressman, we need to leverage that to get things that we need out of the other side. With respect to your question about how do you find moderates in the Syrian armed opposition, that is
If you would, Ambassador, try to keep it brief.
Yeah. The main thing is, Congressman, there are moderates. There always have been moderates. They need support. There is a competition for recruits between moderates and extremists. We need to empower the moderates to be able to recruit better.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, ISIS seeks death and destruction to anyone who does not believe as they do. They have a presence in Syria. They have a presence in Iraq. They're expanding to North Africa. And they appear to be on the move. What is the historical relationship between ISIS and Al-Qaeda? ISIS is an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, a radical outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, I presume, but I need your clarification on that.
The Islamic State is actually the offspring of Al-Qaeda, and in particular the Al-Qaeda in Iraq organization. But originally Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not thinking about setting up a state. Over a period of years, really between 2006 and 2013, Al-Qaeda in Iraq more and more took on the idea of creating a state, of creating the caliphate. But originally, it was loyal to bin Laden and Zawahiri, and the real split that now exists between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda is mainly over this issue of a state.
Okay. In the Middle East or in the continent of Africa, are there instances of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in open conflict?
I am not aware of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State elements fighting each other in North Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa. I've not seen that, but there has certainly been evidence of that in abundance in Lebanon and in Syria.
Okay, so there's clearly the potential for more of that open conflict between those two groups. ISIS wants to be ever present. ISIS wants to control territory and expand its control of that territory. Yet they don't appear at the moment to pose an existential threat to the United States. Al-Qaeda has been more explicit about that. Is that an accurate statement?
The Islamic State has said plenty of blood-curdling things against the United States, and it's threatened the United States on any number of social media messages.
Okay.
I wouldn't call it an existential threat, but it's certainly a terrorist threat, absolutely. And I think we have to take them at their word, Congressman, that if they could reach out and strike us, they would.
Okay. Would you agree that ISIS is a product of decades of failed governance in the Arab world and of the hijacking of Arab Islam, kind of a toxic mix?
Absolutely, that's part of it. For example, there was a really good article in November of last year in the New York Times about Tunisians who were going to the Islamic State-held territories in Syria. Tunisia has a really good middle class. It's suffered, but it's still a strong middle class, Mediterranean influences, and yet thousands of Tunisians have gone over to the Islamic State. And why is that? And the main reason is there are frustrations among many young Tunisians about corruption, lack of opportunity, bad economic opportunities. And so one element of the Islamic State appeal, not the only element, but one element of the appeal is its claim to good governance.
Yeah. You said in your opening statement that ISIS adopts a policy through their ideology of no compromise. Compromise is sin. It rejects pluralism, and it has a presence in an area of the world that is highly pluralistic, and it rejects borders. How do you combat ISIS and their expansion in this part of the world?
It's really important to seize territory because it defines itself as a state. With a bureaucracy and an organization. And therefore, we're ground forces, and I would strongly argue not for American ground forces, but for indigenous ground forces in Iraq, in Syria, elsewhere, Lebanon. I think that's the way to combat it ultimately.
Yeah, but I suppose my point is this. Without compromise, there's no negotiated settlement to this thing anywhere, anytime. And therefore, they have to be destroyed. So
exactly.
So the strategy is then, and we discuss a lot about, where these recruits are coming from. I don't think there's enough emphasis on why they're coming, and I suppose that's a more complicated question with a complicated response to it, but. It seems like there's one objective here, and I suppose the question becomes how best you accomplish that.
You want to strangle it on a variety of different levels, Congressman, whether that be recruitment, financing, access to the media, which ties into recruitment and financing, and control of territory. For sure, undermining its ability to recruit is extremely important, which is why I talked about not playing into the Iran idea.
Great. I yield back. My time's expired.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Ford, good to see you again. The last time we spoke was regarding the red line in Syria prior to Assad crossing the red line. And if you recall, my questioning was what our range of options might be. And so that kind of colors the context of my thinking regarding the administration and my opening statement, et cetera. With that in mind, I think that you may have alluded to the fact that the administration is right to understand that we have to confront the Islamic State and that this is an organization wholly different from al-Qaeda. And I think throughout the course of the discussion, you've kind of buttressed that claim. As an individual who's worked in the current administration and maybe understands better than some of us on the outside do that are casual spectators and frustrated spectators, why do you think, if you would proffer an opinion, the administration, the president in particular, it doesn't seem like he understands the threat that ISIS poses, or at least his actions don't reflect that. Would you comment on that?
I think the administration actually is doing not so bad on Iraq and fighting the Islamic State in Iraq. It's going to be a slow effort, but the ground has been taken back. And although it's not an easy battle, I think there's progress. On the Syria side, Congressman, I think the strategy of simply trying to arm one element of Syrian fighters and sending them into the Islamic State without looking at the broader conflict in the end will not be adequate. There is this, and Congress voted for it, $500 million program to train the new Syrian force, 5, 10,000, maybe 15 if they're lucky, to go in over the next couple of years and fight the Islamic State. I personally doubt very much that that will be an effective way to do it because it won't address the recruitment problem.
So let me clarify, because maybe I wasn't clear. I'm not talking about the borders of Iraq and Syria and what's occurring there so much as the ideology, as I see it, that is not only pervasive to the region, but pervasive around the globe. And when I see that we have leaders come to the White House to have a summit and a discussion, and what comes out of it is some kind of view that the terror movement is not embedded in an ideology, but in socioeconomic disparities, I wonder if I'm and the rest of the world seem completely wholly off base, or the administration is missing the mark, because one of us must be. I mean, when you think that, you know, would you say that Osama bin Laden had economic issues that drove him? I mean, he was a wealthy man. And Ayman al-Zawahiri is I think he's an eye surgeon, right? I mean, these are not people of without means. So why would we focus on the, I understand from a recruitment standpoint it might have a component to it. But we're talking about leaving your home as a teenager to go cut people's heads off and live a life of great hardship.
I'd put it like this, Congressman. For every one Osama bin Laden or every one Ayman Zawahiri, there are probably 50 young Tunisians, young Syrians, young Iraqis who are not necessarily joining because they're ideologically driven, but because they're angry at the world. They don't have economic opportunity. They've been disenfranchised. They're sick of corruption. And so the Islamic State is
There's a lot of Americans that feel that way, have nothing to do with it. But we don't go doing things like the Islamic State does.
The good news is, Congressman, we have a much more responsive political system than most Arab countries do. So those grievances are real, and they drive a lot of the very broad Islamist movement in the region, including the Salafi jihadi element among them. And my experience in the administration is that they focus on that broader problem.
But we can't find jobs in this country for people. We're talking about getting jobs in those countries for people as a solution set to the spread of this scourge. It seems, it's so counterintuitive, and seems, quite honestly, it seems imbecilic.
Actually, Congressman, I don't agree. I think that were socioeconomic conditions better in many Arab countries,
so how do you explain the foreign fighters from America going there?
The foreign fighters from America are a tiny minority.
Regardless.
Excuse me, the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you,
Chair
Mr.
recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just picking up right where Mr. Perry is leaving off, Ambassador Ford, if you were sitting in the Oval Office and President Obama was asking you for advice as to how to evolve the strategy to better defeat the threat, what would you tell him?
Find indigenous groups that will take the lead in combating the Islamic State in North Africa, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. Indigenous. The American role should be supportive, but they need, A, to find indigenous fighters, and B, they need to address root causes. Let me give you an example.
What if you can't find indigenous forces?
Well, but I think you can. And I think, frankly, if you put the resources out there, you can develop the moderate forces. Can I give you an example of what I'm talking about? There's this is a widely known story in Syria, which frankly is where the capital of the Islamic State is now, in Raqqa. So there was a soccer player named Abu Basid Saidud, a soccer player, well known in Syria. He joined the Islamic State after he had been fighting off the Assad regime for 2 years in Homs, saw people bombed, etc., starved because of the regime's brutality. He ended up joining the Islamic State. Syrian activists I know talked to him in January. The families know each other, and said, why would you join an awful organization like the Islamic State? What he said was, how dare you talk to me about human rights and democracy when you people in the West did nothing to help us when we were being bombed and ravaged by the brutal Assad regime? How dare you lecture me? That's what I mean, Congressman. We have to deal with the root causes of the conflict in a place like Syria or a place like Iraq.
Well, Ambassador, I don't know if we really have enough, if there is enough patience where eventually you're going to be able to turn the tide on ISIS. I think that we all need to be much more on our game. And when I say we, it's obviously not just the United States of America. Now, President Obama doesn't have the military experience that his two-star general on the ground has. No disrespect to him, President Bush before him, President Clinton before him. They don't have 6, 7 tours under their belt of commanding troops on the ground. Right now, we have thousands of American service members on the ground in Iraq. And when we had generals before our Foreign Affairs Committee hearing last week, and we were asking what kind of flexibility does that two-star have on the ground, if he knows where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is, and he could send a Navy SEAL team to execute a well-planned mission at night under the cover of darkness to take out the leader of ISIS, or if there was great actionable intelligence where we knew where there was a boatload of computers, for example, what kind of flexibility does this two-star general have? And the general's answer back to me was reading a paragraph essentially saying that the two-star general can make a recommendation. Now, when I'm at events around my district and elsewhere, and I say, who was in charge of the surge in Iraq at the beginning of 2007? Everyone says, Petraeus, Petraeus, Petraeus. How many of you know who the two-star general is who's in charge of our forces on the ground today? I've asked that question to members of Congress, and they don't know the answer to that. And that two-star general doesn't have the flexibility that they need to accomplish their mission to defeat the threat. Now, everything is being micromanaged in the White House. They send an authorization for the use of military force to Congress. We're expected to sign off on it to send our service members overseas. Right now, the 82nd Airborne Division is preparing to go to Iraq. We want to know that we're setting them up to succeed and not fail and to actually defeat the threat. So what may be happening right now, or you might have examples in Iraq, for example, of where we are degrading the threat, taking out some of their command and control, killing some of their bad guys. We need to kill ISIS. We need to destroy them. The whole degrading thing, if we measure success, whether or not we kill a few of the bad guys, but meanwhile their ranks continue to grow, they become billions of dollars richer. Meanwhile, we're negotiating a nuclear arms race, a nuclear deal with Iran that might trigger a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. I'm concerned that this president's strategy is not evolving quick enough to actually defeat the threat, and the people on the ground don't have the ability that they need to take the action that will actually take out leadership when the opportunity presents itself. I asked that general to clarify. I was asking him a different question, and again, he was reading the same exact paragraph, that all he could do is make a recommendation. So here we are, we're facing a real threat that if we don't defeat them overseas, we'll be facing them here at home. We are literally, over the course of the last few weeks, we have gone after people who are now becoming they are self-radicalized U.S. citizens who consider themselves to be citizens of the Islamic State. I believe that the president's strategy needs to evolve. We know what the threat is. Now we need to take it out. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from New York. I want to thank Ambassador Ford and Dr. Ferris. Glad to see that the flight finally made it. We are in the middle of a vote on the House floor. It's one vote, and members have left, and I assume they will come back. But we will start, we'll have your testimony, Dr. Ferris, and Madam Rajavi's testimony when that vote is over with. Ambassador Ford, you do not need to stay. I don't want to hold you up. Probably that's not a good word to use. As a former judge, I shouldn't use the word hold up. And you're welcome to stay or leave, whichever you prefer, but we'll be in recess until the vote is over with, 5 minutes after the vote is over, and then we will have the testimony from our other two witnesses. So the subcommittee is in recess. The subcommittee will come to order. We have two other witnesses to testify. Mrs. Maryam Rajavi is the President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Mrs. Rajavi has appeared before many national parliaments in Europe and has published a book entitled Women Against Islamic Fundamentalism. We also have Dr. Faris. Once again, thank you for getting here, no matter what it took. Dr. Faris is the Co-Secretary General of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism. Dr. Faris is also a professor of global strategies in Washington and has been advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Caucus on Counterterrorism since 2007. And before our next witness testifies, I'd ask that all spectators be seated in the courtroom, or in, sorry, that was a slip from the old days, in the committee room. I used to be a judge, in the committee room. So spectators be seated, please, or leave the court, or leave the room. Thank you. I think we have the electronics working, and Madam Rajavi, we welcome you to the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade. I don't know if you heard that or not, but welcome. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, and the subcommittee is ready to hear your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about this issue. Today, Islamic fundamentalism and extremism under the name of ISIS or Shiite paramilitary groups have turned into a global threat. Islamic fundamentalism emerged as a threat to peace and security when Khomeini stole the leadership of a popular revolution in 1979 and established a religious dictatorship. The Iranian regime has served as the main source of this ominous phenomenon in the region and across the world. The primary objective of Islamic fundamentalists, including ISIS, is to establish an Islamic caliphate and enforce Sharia law. They recognize no borders. Aggressiveness and violence are two common features of Sunni and Shiite extremists. As such, searching for moderates among them is an illusion. In 1993, we published a book, Islamic Fundamentalism, the New Global Threat, warning about this threat and identifying its epicenter in Tehran. We said the mullahs sought to obtain nuclear weapons, to export fundamentalism and guarantee their own existence. Unfortunately, little, if anything, was done to prevent the export of fundamentalism. Experience shows that in the absence of a firm policy vis-à-vis Tehran regime, there will be destructive consequences. Unfortunately, failure to stop the Iranian regime's post-2003 meddling in Iraq, which led to occupy that country and further spreading fundamentalism. Similarly, crimes committed by Bashar Assad in Syria and the massacre and exclusion of Sunnis in Iraq by Maliki, coupled with Western silence, empowered ISIS. I emphasize that the mullahs regime is not part of any solution to current crisis. It is indeed the heart of the problem. The people of Iran indeed call the mullahs regime as godfather of ISIS and other fundamentalist groups. The ultimate solution to this problem is regime change by the Iranian people and resistance. This regime is extremely fragile. As evident during the 2009 uprising, the overwhelming majority of the Iranian people demanded regime change. The regime's show of force is hollow and a result of weak Western policy. Owing to the pivotal role of the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran as a democratic Muslim movement, the Iranian resistance has established itself the antithesis to Islamic fundamentalism. We believe in separation of religion and state, gender equality, respect for rights of religious and ethnic minorities, a democratic and non-nuclear Iran. The following practical steps are necessary to achieve this goal. 1. Expel the Quds force from Iraq and end the Iranian regime's influence in that country. 2. Enable full participation of Sunnis in power sharing and arm Sunni tribes to provide security for their communities. 3. Assist Syria's moderate opposition and people to end Assad's regime and establish democracy in that country. 4. Recognize the Iranian people's aspirations to overthrow the mullahs and ending inaction vis-à-vis the gross human rights violations in Iran. 5. Provide protection for and uphold the rights of members of Iran's organized opposition, the PMOI, in Camp Liberty in Iraq. 6. Empower the true democratic and tolerant Islam to counter fundamentalist interpretations of this religion. And 7. Block all pathways for the mullahs regime to acquire nuclear weapons. But let me finish by a quote from America's first president, George Washington. The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Rajavi. We will have questions for you momentarily, but first we'll hear from Dr. Faris. And for the record, both your testimony and Mrs. Rajavi's testimony will be made a part of the record, and you can summarize your testimony, Dr. Faris.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to thank also the ranking members and the members of the committee for organizing this very important strategic seminar hearing on ISIS defining the enemy. My testimony has a title, Identifying the Jihadi Ideology and Providing Alternative Strategies to Defeat ISIS, which I believe is the heart of the discussion on this panel. For the sake of summary, I would like to go over the major principles I began with. 4 points I'd like to raise. Point number 1, about the ideology displayed by the Islamic State, its roots, its evolution, and ultimately its final goals. And the question I raise, are we dealing with a new ideology? Is ISIS producing a new ideology, or is it an ideology that has been around through various organizations, various movements, and now has reached a mutation that is allowing ISIS to win and win further? Point 2 I'm going to raise is about if ISIS is unchecked, if the current situation of status quo, which I call moving status quo, take few villages, they take back few villages despite the destruction of their military machine. If that situation continues, what should we be expecting in Iraq and Syria, in the region and beyond, and maybe beyond, that is, in our homelands, including the United States and across the Atlantic? 3, there is a current geopolitical problem or a series of problems in the confrontation with ISIS nowadays as we speak. I would like to offer a very short identification of what are these 2 problems. Why are we obstructed? Why are we not ending ISIS, as many in this House, in the Senate, and the European Parliament have been asking? And last, what can the United States and its allies do, or actually I would say should do, to defeat ISIS and the movements behind ISIS, because ISIS is just a stage in a movement that began before and will continue later. In my past 30 years of research, 6 books focusing on future jihad and the evolution of this war of ideas, I have made the case that what we are dealing with, particularly since 9/11, and the 9/11 Commission has been very clear on this, we are dealing with an ideology that is producing a movement and not a movement that is producing the ideology. Hence, I have recommended that the United States, past administration and this administration and future administrations would actually engage in a battle that we have not engaged in, which is to respond to the ideology, to actually mobilize those forces and civil societies that can respond to this ideology. And after doing this, we can encourage the societies that could be and would be freed from ISIS to form an intellectual resistance to stop the return of ISIS. Remember, dear members, that we were in Iraq. We left Iraq. There was an Iraqi army. That Iraqi army was in the Sunni areas. So the maximum that our hopes would be right now would be for the same forces to go into the same regions, defeat ISIS. We have defeated Al-Qaeda before. So there is a constant phenomenon that keeps bringing back the jihadists, not just to Iraq this time, but to Syria, as far as Libya and Yemen and North Nigeria. I have suggested in my research that, number one, we need to identify the ideology, but number two, we need to have a coalition with forces that are willing to push back against the ideology. One cannot win a war of ideas from an American perspective against the whole world. We need to have allies, and the most important allies should be in the region. The problem has been, in the past, that we have ignored them. We have partnered with many forces, but I assume, and I'll make the case, that we have a partner with the wrong persons, with the wrong forces. Partnering, for example, with the Muslim Brotherhood, even though this is based on the notion that moderate Islamists can be a wall against extremist Islamists. That's what we've heard from Washington over the past years. But we forget one thing, is that we do not control what happens. If we support the moderate Islamists without making sure that they are vetted, that they will move against the jihadists, what will happen, and it already happened in Syria, is when we supported moderate Islamists, they became al-Nusra, and from al-Nusra they ended up becoming ISIS. So we need to have a better, not just vetting system, but a better system of ideas that upon which we can develop the strategy. Last but not least, in my last book, The Lost Spring, I urged the administration and of course Congress to act faster before the catastrophes hit, and that was last March, before ISIS takes over half of Syria and 1/3 of Iraq, before ISIS lands in Benghazi and Darna, before the Houthis, pro-Iranian militias, expand. All of this happened since last June. If you look at the map, the historical map of these events, most of the explosions that we are dealing with happened over the past 9 months. On the ideological level, it is clear that this group, ISIS, has not invented new ideas. The success of ISIS is that it had made into reality all the dreams of the previous ideologies and previous jihadists. What is ISIS in Iraq and Syria? It's the dream of bin Laden. He spoke about it. Killing infidels, every single jihadist since the 20s have been talking about it. The major difference is that this Daesh, ISIS or ISIL, has been able, because of their strength, because of the chaos in the region, but I would add, because of our policies, which were not preemptive enough or formed the right coalitions at the right time. Second, if not checked, ISIS is projected to increase its control of the Sunni areas where they are. But that control is not going to be only military. My concern and the concern of many of my colleagues who have been looking at what this organization is doing, number one, they are drafting. So we're not just talking about individuals who have been in Al-Qaeda and other places and now adhering to ISIS. They are going into cities and towns and drafting. So their numbers are supposed to grow. My greater concern, dear members, is that they are now schooling, they are doing in Iraq and in Syria what the Taliban have done 2 decades ago in parts of Afghanistan and in Pakistan. They are creating already the next generation. And this is not something secret. We don't need even intelligence to know that. It's on YouTube. We see those kids aged between 8 and 12 being schooled into ideological madrasas. And hence my first conclusion. Even if we take back Mosul, if we take back Tikrit, if we take back Raqqa in Syria or others would do, my concern is that the next generation is being worked on right now. So we need to have a strategy with regard the ideological confrontation. Third, the geopolitical problems that we are facing in fighting ISIS today. I would identify 2 major obstructions. One, definitely, and it responds to my concern, we don't have a war of ideas. I've reviewed every single piece of what we call in Washington strategic communications campaign, de-radicalization campaign. I would be more than happy to expand on that when and if needed. We are not winning on the ideological level. An argument such as the one discussed earlier, that a jihadi becomes jihadi because there is no job, and I'm not talking about the politics of it, I'm talking about the academic dimension of it. That argument is not true. It has been debunked in the Middle East. When you talk to intellectuals in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, and other parts of the Middle East, they do not adopt this argument. A jihadi becomes a jihadi simply because of indoctrination. And the evidence is, if you have 1 million individuals in any country in the Middle East that is jobless, why would 500 of these 1 million choose to become jihadi? What is the difference? Why wouldn't the 1 million become jihadists? It's the same frustration. The others would choose to become revolutionaries, reformers, do demonstrations, find a job. They would choose many other options. Science and research has told us those who have shifted to become jihadists, even if they are under duress sociologically, have been indoctrinated before. There is a chip that was put in their mind by different ways that allowed them to take the argumentation of, we are now jihadists. And by the way, dear members, the jihadists themselves never use the socioeconomic element. They would never say, I didn't find a job, or I was frustrated, therefore I became. They didn't even use the norm of, we are against the richer people. Their concern is caliphate or no caliphate. Their concern is to win that battle on the ground or not.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. I'll let you go a little longer. I need time for the members to ask questions as well to both of the witnesses, but I thank you for your testimony. Mrs. Rajavi, your testimony as well. I'll recognize myself for questions. How is ISIS philosophy different from Sunnis, say, in Saudi Arabia or Shiites in Iran? First, you, Dr. Ferris.
Well,
briefly.
There's a first difference between all Sunni Salafis are on one hand, and then the Shia jihadists, those that Madame Rajavi has mentioned, meaning the Iranian regime and the Pasdaran, they both want the establishment of an international, universal Islamic empire with different names. While the Salafis in general choose the caliphate, the Khomeinis use the imamate for historical reasons that we don't probably have the time to go over. But between ISIS and between the Saudis accept, they are Salafi in their essence, but do accept the international system. They have ambassadors, they accept the United Nations, they accept a minimum of consensus. While ISIS doesn't accept borders, doesn't accept the existence of the international system and act in the result of that.
Mrs. Rajavi, same question. How does ISIS, a philosophy different from Sunnis in Saudi Arabia or Shiites in Iran?
بعد به شما بگم که تا اونجا که به شکلگیری داعش برمیگرده این ملاها بودن که کمک
So far as the formation of the ISIS is concerned, it was also the mullahs regime who helped the creation of ISIS and the crimes committed by the Iranian regime and Assad and the killing of the Sunnis in Iraq helped the emergence of ISIS. Therefore, gaining state power, and it was the Iranian regime when there was a state in Iran turned created the terrorism as a major threat
اما
for
از نظر اعتقادی
global peace and security. But from a philosophical
به لحاظ اعتقادی
spectrum,
در تمام گروه‌های
the most
بنیادگرا
fundamental
چه شیعه
element
و
in
چه سنی.
all fundamentalist group, whether Sunni or
اونها
Shiite,
در این نکاتی که الان من میگم مشترکن.
they have common on the following.
تحمیل دین با توسل به زور.
They want to force their religion or school of thought.
برقراری یک استبداد موحش به نام ولایت فقیه یا به نام خلافت اسلام.
Establish a religious dictatorship whether under the name of caliphate or the absolute rule of the clergy.
بی‌اعتقادی به مرزها و جهات برای گرفتن کشورهای دیگه.
Not believe in any borders and going after expansion and capturing other territories.
و تکفیر کسانی که به اصطلاح احکام شریعت رو
Also believe that those who do not accept the Sharia law must be eliminated.
و من دلم میخواد اینجا تاکید کنم
And I want
که
to
آنتیتز این تفکرم
stress that there is an antithesis to this philosophy, and that is a tolerant and democratic interpretation of Islam.
بین داعش و ملاهای ایران جنگ هژمونی وجود داره.
There is a conflict between the ISIS and the mullahs in Iran, but that's the internal power struggle.
اما علیرغم هر اختلافی
But despite
ادامه
any
بقای بنیادگران
differences, the continuation of other fundamentalist group very much hinges on the Iranian regime being in power, remaining in power. Terrorism and fundamentalism under the name of Islam came to the world seen by the mullahs regime in Iran, and when this regime is overthrown, that will be limited or destroyed. And it is interesting that after the emergence of ISIS, the people of Iran called ISIS the godfather of ISIS.
من اینجا میخوام در مقابل نکته که گفتین در مورد عربستان به شما
And regarding the Saudi Arabia, I want to add that ISIS, contrary to Saudi Arabia, do not believe in borders.
بنابراین مشکل در سلفی بودن یا سنی بودن یا این
The
اعتقادات
question is
نیست.
not being Sunni or Salafi or whatever.
مشکل در اون اعتقاداتی که الان من اسم بردم
The problem is those characteristics which
اینجا
I
اونجایی
just
که داعش رو
identified.
در واقع مشخص میکنه و نزدیکیش رو قبل از هر
That's
چیز
where
به
you will see
بنیادگراهای حاکم بر ایران.
that despite all the differences, how ISIS is very close to the fundamentalist ruling in Iran. Thank you.
Mrs. Rajavi, let me ask you a question that you made a comment about. How do you see the mullahs in Iran having facilitated and helped the ISIS movement? How has ISIS been able to expand its influence, its philosophy, because of the mullahs in Iran? Make that clear, if you would, on how there's that connection.
شما میدونید که داعش و رژیم همچنان که گفتم بر سر هژمونی اختلاف دارن.
As I said, there is power struggle between ISIS and the Iranian regime. But at the same time, on occasions, they have cooperated. For example, Zarqawi, the original founder and leader of ISIS, received enormous logistic support from the Iranian regime, and he had his bases even in Iran. And I think it was in 2005 that intelligence security services in Germany exposed this connection between Zarqawi and the Iranian regime. And also there has been many reports, even in the media, that Bashar al-Assad released many of the ISIS members from prison in order to join ISIS. While in their air attack, they have never attacked ISIS.
و تمرکزش علیه اپوزیسیون میانه رو سوریه.
The focus is on the moderate opposition in Syria.
میخوام این نتیجه رو بگیرم.
So I want to conclude that
اونجایی که به رژیم برمیگرده رژیم
so far as the mullahs regime in Iran is concerned,
پشتیبان 100% بشار اسد در سوریه است.
They are 100% supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
تاکید کنم که کارها و جنایت‌هایی که بشار اسد
all the crimes that are committed by the
سوریه انجام داده
help and support of the mullahs regime has created a fertile ground for ISIS to emerge, and on the other hand,
جنایاتی که مالکی
crimes committed by Maliki at the behest of the Iranian regime in Iraq,
سرکوب گسترده
and in particular the absolute suppression of the Sunnis,
باعث شده که داعش به این شکل
has led to empowering ISIS to expand itself both in Iraq and Syria.
I'll yield 5 minutes to the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on Ambassador Ford's testimony in terms of Dr. Faris. I really want to see if we can get to the root of some things, as short as this time is. Your main thought was that the ideology is the controlling factor, the absolute controlling factor that happens. Is that correct? I think I got that.
The ideology is what produces them, but it's not the only element that controls their action. But without the ideology, they cannot be produced. So the movement can use the spool only if it exists.
So the leaders would be pure to that ideology.
Yes, the leaders who are produced by this movement, if they are eliminated, that would slow down the activity of the movement.
And here's where I have a problem trying to just put everything. It's nice to put everything in one box. I wish we could in this instance, but if it was absolutely controlling, how do you explain then that ISIL will then take cultural artifacts and they'll destroy them because what they're uncompromising, as Ambassador Ford said, and they're ideologically centered. So they're destroying those cultural artifacts that aren't consistent with their ideological beliefs. But if they're so pure, why are they taking these things then and selling them, preserving them to get money? Isn't that more the actions of a criminal enterprise too? I mean, it's not as simple, it's complex. And I think that's part of it. If we focus on one narrow box, we're going to miss the whole picture. But there's an element of that, isn't there, with ISIL?
Mr. Congressman, I think it's the other way around, if I may, not disagree, but readjust the argument. In past similar situations with totalitarian armies that were supposed to go only by ideology, and I'm talking about World War II, should it be the Nazi armies or the Soviet armies, you can't get more totalitarian and disciplined. They have done the same. Rank and file could go against the ideology and the instructions that are...
These are the leaders that are making these decisions.
The leaders of the ISIS movement can also be corrupt, there is no doubt about it. And there were leaders in the communist movement in the past, during the Cold War, and guerrilla forces that were corrupt. My point is, we have to give what to Caesar is to Caesar, and of course, what the corrupt are doing, it's their natural behavior. Yeah. I am not claiming that the ideology will only produce a perfect behavior. But what I'm claiming is that without the ideology, you cannot have jihadists. Then the other argument would win.
But they're related, and they can't, I don't think, be ignored. Ambassador Ford, I'm sorry you weren't here, and thank you for coming and making the trouble with the plane flights and all. But Ambassador Ford, upon being pressed in questioning, became clear there are other social factors that are a part of this. And to me, the chairman's experience in law enforcement, as a judge, mine as a prosecutor, there's social issues that breed criminal activity. It's not, there are people in the same social settings with the same challenges. They don't become criminals. But there's some that are.
That's true.
And more so or not. And you can't say that that's not a factor even. So I think the social conditions, and I'm sorry you weren't here to hear Ambassador Ford's testimony, but they are a factor as well. It's not pure ideology. And I don't deny there's ideology. That's a given.
I hear you, Congressman. There is a point, of course, in socioeconomics for everything else, not just for the jihadists, but for every ultra-nationalist movement. Let me draw your attention to the fact that Egypt, in 2013, while the argument was that people were adhering to the Muslim Brotherhood because they were not finding jobs or because of the social conditions. Well, on June 30th, 2013, 33 million Egyptians, 80% of whom are under the level of poverty, marched against the Muslim Brotherhood. That defeats the logic that it's only socioeconomic, but I do agree with you that socioeconomics are part of it.
Yeah, that's important, because I think if we're going to fight them, we have to fight them in so many different levels. One of the things you brought up that I thought was very important was our messaging and how we can do a better job messaging. And I think we have to incorporate the Muslim community back home and have their voices, be trusted voices in opposition. But if you could comment just briefly on what we could do not only in the U.S. but in Europe and Turkey, in approaching this problem. I gave you a lot in a short time, so I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you again. I did 5 years long research on our messaging, both administrations, the bureaucracy in general. The problem is, first of all, we have to vet who we are working with in terms of message, meaning we need to work with NGOs who have had an experience on the ground in the region and have an experience here, and be diverse as much as possible. Even within our own communities, when we are dealing with organizations, we cannot say this one organization represents the entire community unless we have referendums in this country, which I don't think under the Constitution we do. So I agree fully with you. The next stage to push back against radicalization is from within these communities to have NGOs that are vetted and that they are willing to push back against the doctrine.
Well, thank you. I'm over my time, but I think this is a crucial issue that we have to address. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Keating was just asking about the social economics. My question, I just want to get to the heart, Doctor, of what is the most effective way to get inside the head of ISIS and demoralize them?
Well, that's a different battle, Mr. Congressman, from the interception I suggest, but I'll answer both. Pushing back against an individual who has already been radicalized is a much bigger mission. It would need a much larger mobilization. It needs for ISIS elements to feel that the people is against them and that the international community and the region are against them. So that responds to what the Congress has mentioned about strategic communication. We need to do a better job. Our Arab broadcast, our Persian broadcast that the Congress funds here has not been doing, in my own view, enough to push back against these organizations. But I do propose that before these individuals are radicalized, this is where we need to interfere. When kids are 10 and 12 and 13, in a short 10 years, as in Afghanistan or as in Iraq and in Syria, they are the new ISIS. So we need to add and supply strategies that would help first women, their mothers, and teachers, and the NGOs to be part of this enterprise, not just on the military level, not just on the economic level, but on the educational level.
What is the most effective way, though, for those who are currently part of ISIS who are beheading individuals in their region? What is the best way to get into the head of ISIS and demoralize them?
Congressman, it's only a massive military defeat of large areas controlled by ISIS.
I mean, I totally agree with you.
Yes.
I mean, we could spend a lot of time here, talking about other elements of what we are up against. And we can have a hearing dedicated to talking about social economics. We can all admit that maybe there's something to do with the economy. That might have something to do with it. But the best way to get into the head of a member of ISIS is to put a round in it, is with lead. Honestly, they have to be defeated. That is what we're up against. And we can have a tremendous amount of patience waiting for someone else to fill this vacuum and step up in the region. But listen, when you want to be the leader of the free world, American exceptionalism isn't about figuring out a way to get everyone a job. King Abdullah of Jordan, when one of their pilots is executed, isn't filming a video to ISIS and the rest of the world how we need to get them more jobs. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, when he's giving a speech about what we do with our enemies around the world, it's not that we need to give them more wealth. I mean, we have to confront this threat. And honestly, if you want to demoralize them, if you want to defeat ISIS, it is not going to be done through social programs of giving people jobs and more wealth. The world needs America to lead. Now, it's our responsibility here to ensure that we are never setting our service members up to defeat. I do not support occupations enduring ground operations, but there's a big difference when you're talking about Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Green Berets, Marines, Army Rangers, who in the middle of the night under the cover of darkness, they're going to show up at areas where ISIS is operating, where ISIS is sleeping. And they are going to execute well-planned missions that is going to take out high-value targets and capture actionable intelligence. Our enemies do not respect weakness, they only respect strength. And strength cannot be shown just by finding jobs for more people who are members of ISIS. It is divorced from reality to spend time here talking about social economics as if that is the root of what we are up against and that is the way to turn the tide. We're all saying it's part of it, That might be why some people are getting involved in ISIS, might have something to do with economics. That's not going to eliminate the threat. Now, Madam Rajavi, listening to you speak and mentioning the Green Revolution back in 2009, and we think about the undemocratic elections that took place in Iran. At that point, when the economy was doing better and oil was $100 a barrel, and millions of Iranians were rising up to take control of their country. And our president was saying that that was none of our problem. Fast forward today when the economy is worse and oil is $50 a barrel, and people like you are showing leadership, willing to take control of your own destiny. I honestly do not know whether or not my president is on the same exact team that I am. Because there are individuals like you who are willing to rise up and take control of your country's future and destiny with a vision, whether it is Iran or Syria or elsewhere, to bring stability to the Middle East. I commend you for being here and for leading your effort. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the last gentleman and point out on the issue of socioeconomics not being the driving force. Keep in mind, 19 of the 20 hijackers on 9/11 were from a rich, oil-rich country and were middle class in their background. They did not take over those planes because they couldn't support their families. This hearing is about defining the enemy, and the president is attacked by some because he doesn't have the courage to give ISIS the ideological victory that ISIS wants. ISIS wants to be called the Islamic State. They want to be regarded as Islamic. They want to be regarded as a state. I think they are heretic terrorists, not Islamic scholar statesmen. And so I do not think the president should be criticized for not calling them Islamic when they are heretics and not calling them a state when they are terrorists. Also, the topic of this hearing is defining the enemy, and I think the greatest enemy is the Shiite alliance, and I've said that before in this room. The alliance of Iran, Assad, Hezbollah, now the Houthi, has killed more Muslims, killed more Americans, and poses a greater threat of mass destruction than does ISIS. Glad to have Mrs. Rajavi here. I want to thank the MEK for revealing to the world the Natanz nuclear plant. There may have been a few members of the Intel Committee who knew that before the MEK told us, but speaking on behalf of roughly 400 members of Congress, thank you for telling Congress as well. Now, you personally promote a very tolerant and moderate view of Islam. You're an advocate of the separation of religion and state, and you've been an advocate for human rights and women's rights. Of course, your country is ruled by very rigid laws that call for stoning people and chopping off limbs. ISIS does the same thing, supposedly in support of a different version of Islam, Iran being Shiite, ISIS being Sunni. Why is their understanding of Islam the same, and or at least similar to our eyes? And why do both the rulers of Iran and ISIS enforce their beliefs through these gruesome measures? If you could respond. I'm sorry, we're unable to hear you. I don't know if our
technical difficulty here.
Technical people can help that.
Thank you very much, Congressman Sherman. You touched upon a very important issue. You said that Islamic fundamentalism of the kind of the Shiite is even more dangerous than the Sunnite one.
قبل از هر چیزم علتش اینه که
Before anything else, the reason is that there is a state in power in the dimension of the mullah's regime in a country, in a vast country with so much resources, financial resources,
و اونها رو
and it's supporting this Shiite fundamentalist group financially, ideologically, and logistically, and in every field. Therefore, they are much more dangerous. I agree with you.
در مورد این که پرسیدین چرا
Regarding your question, that why they resort to so much violence to pursue, and I should tell you that the reason is
از طریق ایجاد وحشت
they can only survive through absolute fear, terror and fear.
و این روال 30 ساله
This has been the trend of over 30 years of ruling fundamentalists in Tehran
الان گسترش پیدا
that now has expanded to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, and other countries.
و بقیه بنیادگراهم از
And
در
other fundamentalists
ملاها یاد گرفتن.
take lesson from their godfather.
فراموش نکنید
Let's not forget that the mullahs,
نوع شکنجه
for example, in Iran, they are implementing more than 70 kind of different torture, cutting off limbs or gouging out eyes, executing pregnant women, and all the heinous crimes that one might imagine. And now
این گروه از جمله داعش و بقیه گروه‌های بنیادگرا از اونها
ISIS and other fundamentalists are really imitating from the mullahs in Iran. Therefore, I reiterate once again that the ultimate solution is one, evict, dislodge the Iranian regime from Syria and Iraq and Yemen, and even more important, regime change in Iran. The fundamentalist regime in Iran must be changed because this regime has created a political umbrella and a source of ideology and logistical support and financial support for the fundamentalists and terrorism in today's world. And if it was not due to the destructive influence of the Iranian regime, we would not face the situation today in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, and they would have a stability. Let's not forget that by regime change in Iran, those militia under the command of the Quds force, like the Hezbollah in Lebanon or Ansarullah of the Houthis in Yemen and other various groups in Iraq, would be eliminated without having their support, and they would not have the vital environment to others.
Gentleman, yield back his time.
I'd love to ask another question, but I've gone over. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, we got called out for votes, but you were making 3 points when I came in. And number 2 was you made reference to ideological confrontation. I presume toward the goal to delegitimize ISIS. Could you elaborate further?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. The first goal is to delegitimize them, but there is a more important goal, is to encourage and mobilize civil societies where ISIS control to eventually, when ISIS control is eliminated by military means, there will be no neo-ISIS. My whole point to the panel is that ISIS is a neo-Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is neo-Ansar al-Sharia. These are organizations, every time there is a problem and a suppression, they come back. So the ideological battle is not just to deter them, it's to create a resistance inside these societies to make it impossible for a new ISIS to emerge.
So you have to confront the ideology in order to stop the evolution of these groups from proliferating. So how is that done?
It's done in the field where it's been fought. The message that ISIS and the jihadists are producing and, of course, sending through internet, and the problem is not internet and Facebook. The problem is who is responding to them. We need to partner with and work with leaders and ideologues, such as spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. I just came back from Egypt a few weeks ago. I met with Sheikh al-Azhar, the equivalent of the Sunni Pope. We had a long conversation. He is ready to mobilize against this fair thinking. There are many clerics around the Muslim world. They are ready to move. Their problem, there is no coordination among themselves and us.
With all due respect, we hear this all the time, but it never happens. You know, the United States, whether you agreed with our involvement in Iraq, you know, the best that we could hope for was taking out a bad guy and creating a breathing space within which Shia, Sunni, and Kurds could develop some kind of social contract and live peacefully amongst one another. Obviously, that didn't happen. You know, some would say that ISIS is just trying to get their country back in Iraq because the origins of ISIS clearly are de-Baathification and the dissolution of the Iraq army under Saddam Hussein, who were Sunnis. And maybe it's second generation, but as you talk about the continuum of this kind of extremist activity, their roots are somewhere. I suppose the question is, you know, where is the end, and how do you achieve that? You also said that jihadis become jihadis by indoctrination. And I know there was some discussion here about whether or not socioeconomic factors contribute to that. I suppose they do to a degree. It's not certainly not the only vulnerability to radicalization, but I would suggest, I would argue that some of it is. You know, I think the American people become very frustrated because we, as the indispensable nation, are called upon to try to intervene to resolve these problems. But yet at its core, these problems have to be resolved internally. You know, the Middle East is a very pluralistic society. There's a very pluralistic society, but there's a zero-sum game mentality. And in order for somebody to win, somebody has to lose. And that's why Bashir al-Assad in Syria enjoys partnerships with people that he has no interest in. Just because they're minorities, the Sunnis take over, they feel as though they'll get slaughtered. And therefore, they align themselves with Bashir al-Assad so that they don't get slaughtered. There's no recognition of minority rights. You know, in game theory, there's also what's referred to as a variable sum game. And that means that there can be multiple winners. But in order to promote a peaceful path toward an existence of peaceful coexistence, there has to be pretty profound compromises. You know, I referenced before, in Northern Ireland, they had a history, a horrible history, of Protestants and Catholics killing each other. No troops were deployed by the United States in Northern Ireland. But both sides, in order to participate in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, had to denounce violence publicly. Paramilitaries on both sides, the Irish Republican Army and the Protestant paramilitaries. And they actually had to participate in the destruction of their arms with an international tribunal. And, you know, my point is, you're either going to get democracy through peaceful means or, in the absence of that, civil war. You know, the United States fought a civil war where 650 to 700,000 people were killed at a time where our country's population was about 30 million people. I mean, that's very, very significant. But that's the consequence of not being able to resolve your problems peacefully. So as we, you know, look for solutions with these very clear maps of delineation as to who's responsible, but this is, you know, this is probably pretty accurate. There's a lot of duplicity going on there. You know, Tom Friedman, the author and New York Times columnist, once said that, is Iraq the way it is because Saddam is the way he is? Or is Saddam the way he is because Iraq is the way it is? And I think unless and until these Middle Eastern countries recognize, you know, that there's something beyond the horizon than hating one another and killing each other in the name of God, then we're just going to be at this table and these panels for years and years to come. There's got to be some enlightenment, and that's going to require leadership. And it's going to require leadership in the Arab Muslim world.
And you yield back your time. And without objection, this chart that was hastily made by the chair will be made part of the record. And with ask unanimous consent that Mr. Davis, who's not a member of this committee, be allowed to ask questions. And if there's no objection, then the chair recognizes Mr. Davis from Illinois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your indulgence. Indeed, I am not a member of this subcommittee, but I do have interest in the subject matter, and I want to thank you, and I thank both of our witnesses for being here. Mrs. Rahava, over the past 30 years, the United States has been drawn into some serious diplomatic and military dead ends in the Mideast by mistakenly backing individuals and organizations claiming popular support, which turned out to be largely exaggerated and somewhat manufactured. Would you please tell us about the role of the National Council of Resistance in Iranian civil life and its place in current Iranian political life, and how do you measure your popular support in Iran?
که اختناق مطلق مراجعه به افکار عمومی نیست.
Absolute repression. It is not possible to go to the vote of people and see what the people really think, and the mullahs will never accept a free election. Therefore,
پشتوانه اجتماعی این مقاومت
the yardstick or the
پایداری
gauge
و
for
گسترش این
the
مقاومت
popularity of this movement, one is its persistence,
اون هم علیرغم سرکوب شدید
continuation
و اعدام
of
120
its
تن از بهترین
principles,
فرزندان مردم
despite
ایران.
the absolute repression and having lost 120,000 of its members and sympathizers who were executed by the regime. I show you now this book, which includes the names of some 20,000 of members of this resistance movement from different strata of the Iranian society.
شما می‌دونید جمع‌آوری 20,000 در
So
دوران
you can imagine that collecting such information during the repression is very difficult.
و ترس رژیم از مقاومت
Indication is the fear
و
of
کارداری
the
شیطانسازی بر
regime
مخدوش
and
کردن این
its
چهره مقاومت
engagement in
یکی
demonizing
از نشانه‌های دیگر از قدرت این
the
مقاومت.
Iranian resistance is another indication of the strength of the resistance and its
در
popularity.
تمام مراودات دیپلماتیک
As you may know,
درخواست
in
اول
all the
رژیم
diplomatic
محدود کردن
correspondence that they have, their main demands from their interlocutors is to restrict the activities of our movement, and any affiliation with our movement in Iran is equal to execution.
در قیام 2009
In 2009
تظاهرات ضد حکومتی
uprising, the regime's officials acknowledged publicly that those demonstrations were organized by Mujahideen Network, the Endicott Network in Iran, and the popular support has enabled this movement also to have access to most secret information of the Iranian regime on nuclear, on missile, and what the Quds Force is doing in the region, as well as the human rights violations in Iran. We have always said to the Mullah's regime that if you really claim that our movement has no popular support, let's have a free election under the auspices of the international community, and let's see who has the support of the Iranian people. But let's not forget, a free election for the mullahs is a red line.
Thank you very much, Dr.
خیلی متشکرم.
Dr. Ferris, do you believe that the United States should be cooperating militarily with Iran in combating ISIS in Iraq and Syria? And if yes, how and to what extent? Is it direct cooperation or indirect cooperation through the Iraqi government? And if no, why not?
Well, I'll begin by the answer no, and certainly no, Mr. Congressman. I'll give the argument that unless there is a change in the government and in the direction, at least, of Iranian policy in the region, cooperating with a regime that is waging a campaign in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and now in Yemen against 5 or 7 of our own allies, and probably soon to be trying to destabilize Bahrain, it would be a strategic mistake. So I'm not against the principle that the United States would cooperate with anybody to defeat the terrorists. But if we cooperate with the Iranians as they are engaged militarily against our own allies, and there is something even more important, every inch of land taken away from ISIS, which is the good thing, all depends on who's taken away that inch from the organization. If the Iranian-controlled militias or Iranians with different aspects in Iraq are taken over, we would be replacing one problem with another problem. So my answer is clearly no to that cooperation unless we see a change or a reform. And clearly, we have not seen yet a Gorbachev-like perestroika or glasnost inside Iran for the time being.
Thank you very much. And, Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for your indulgence. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Without objection, unanimous consent, Chair will allow another individual who is not a member of this committee to ask questions. Ms. Chu from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to address these questions to Mrs. Rajavi. I'd like to ask about Camp Liberty. Camp Liberty is a military base that's become a permanent home for over 3,000 Iranian refugees, but the conditions there are poor and freedom is very severely restricted. Worse, there are reports that the Iraqi government is blockading the base, preventing food, water, and medicine from arriving. Combined with the restriction on travel, this blockade has led to at least 25 deaths, the most recent being Mr. Jalal Abedini on April 17th. Can you give us a sense of living conditions in Camp Liberty in regard to food, medicine, and decent housing?
من باید بگم که ما عمیقاً نگران وضعیت ساکنان در
Our prime concern about the residents in Camp Liberty is their safety and security.
مشکل اصلی لیبرتی فقدان امنیت و حفاظته.
That is the main problem that they're facing in Camp Liberty now.
به طوری که از زمان انتقال حفاظت
To the extent that since the protection of the residents were transferred from the United States to Iraq, 126 have been killed.
7 تن به گروگان گرفته شد.
7 have been taken hostage.
ساکنان از دسترسی به موقع به مراقبت‌های پزشکی
The residents are denied timely access to medical care.
به همین علت
And for this reason, so far as you just mentioned, 25 people have lost their lives,
در حالی که امکان نجات اونها بوده.
there was the possibility to save their life.
ببخشید 127 نفر تا الان کشته شدن.
I think it was 127 who have been killed during these attacks by the Iraqi forces, and they have no freedom of movement. And enormous restrictions have been imposed on them.
از جمله هنوز کمپ لیبرتی به برق.
Just give you one example, Camp Liberty is not still connected, the electricity is not connected to the city grid. And since the Abadi government took office, there has been no changes in the condition, and there is still a prison-like situation for the residents. And I think the new government must recognize Camp Liberty as a refugee camp and remove and lift all the inhuman restrictions which have been imposed on the camp, and put an end to the daily harassment of the residents. In particular, it is very important that the camp management be changed, because they are the same people. The people who are in the camp management are the same people who were engaged in the massacre and the killing of the residents in the past attacks. And as you know, the United States government had made a written commitment to provides the safety and security for these people, but that obligation has been violated, and I think Camp Liberty should be really put under the protection of United States, or at least their personal weapons to be given, so that if they are attacked by the militias or paramilitary groups, that they could defend themselves. And I expect that the United States would uphold its commitment to regular monitoring of Camp Liberty.
let me ask now about, do you have any confidence in the current government to improve conditions? And what is the future for the people at Camp Liberty? Is there a U.S. role?
می‌کنیم که آمریکا در واقع باید از دولت عراق بخواد که مسئولیتش انجام
بده. The U.S. government can really demand and urge the Iraqi government to uphold its obligations.
تا الان این دولت کاری نکرده که ما بتونه به اون اعتماد کنیم.
So far, the government has not done anything that we could really trust them that they will do the right
و
thing.
کماکان افراد در لیبرتی در حالت
And as I
زندان
said,
هستند.
that people are still living in a prison-like situation in Camp Liberty, just as a prisoner.
دولت جدید عراق باید کمپ لیبرتی رو به عنوان کمپ
That's what I said, that the new government should recognize Liberty as a refugee camp and remove all the restriction imposed on the camp and end the harassment of the residents.
و همچنان که گفتم مدیریت کمپ رو عوض کنه.
And I want to reiterate that it is very vital to change the camp management and do not allow the mullah's regime to send its agents for psychological torture of the residents and laying the ground for another massacre in Camp Liberty. These are the actions that they can take. And I believe that the United States government is in a position to really call and demand from the U.S. Iraqi government to uphold these obligations.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. We've also been joined on the dais by the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, without objection, unanimous consent that she'll be allowed to question the witnesses. You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your kindness, and let me add my appreciation to both you and Ranking Member Sherman and all the members on this panel for their courtesies extended, and to indicate that this is a very historic hearing because as far as my memory can recollect, Mr. Chairman, this is one of the few times that the voice of the opposition of the government of Iran has been part of an official discussion. And that's very important for the American people and for us to formulate the right kinds of policies. Many of us worked for long years to ensure that this great leader, who happens to be a woman, would be able to speak and would be able to lead the MEK and be removed from the terrorist list. There were many machinations and court decisions, and we have moved to a decision which I think reflects the fairness of this nation. Might I also say that the importance of hearing both views in the backdrop of ISIS and the backdrop of the merging of the caliphate, it's from Syria to Iraq to Iran, is very important. As we watch Yemen and we watch Libya, we know that we have to come together around a full understanding of the influence and impact of ISIS. So let me say to Mr. Harvey, who has been a continuing leader and someone who has opened her information cycle, if I will, to ensure that information be given. She doesn't hide information. She has been open and forthright. So I would like to pose these questions. We're trying to discern ISIS, the enemy, and I would just make the comment that any organization that beheads and uses the kind of horrific video to intimidate certainly is a defined enemy from my perspective, and all those who contribute to the growth and continuation of ISIS, using them as a front for the dastardly deeds they want to do, we have to review. We have to look at Syria. We have to look at what is happening in Iraq, and we certainly must look at what is happening in Iran. But I do want to say as well, in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Agreement framework, which we don't have, I still believe that we should look at that in a way that we look and analyze first before we condemn, and we take the input that members of Congress will hopefully be able to give, and we look forthright to ensure that Iraq knows we mean business. But more importantly, this agreement that may come about with Iran is to enhance the security of the United States of America. To Ms. Harvey, I would like to ask the question, that you promote a very tolerant and moderate view of Islam. You are an advocate of separation of religion and state, and you also favor women's rights and human rights. Is it true that Iran is upholding laws that call for the stoning to death of people and the chopping off of limbs? Can she hear that I was directing that question?
There's a satellite involved in this
So it's some
communication, and
Yeah.
it takes a while, plus the translation.
Thank you.
دقیقاً
Yes, precisely.
باید به شما بگم که
I should say
اونچه
that
که ملاهای حاکم بر تهران
what
انجام
the
میدن
mullahs
به نام
ruling Iran
اسلامه،
under
ولی
the
ربطی به اسلام
pretext of Islam they are doing it under the pretext of Islam, but has nothing to do with Islam. They stone people, amputate limbs, and they rape people. And so far, as I said, 120,000 of the best children of the Iranian people have been executed under the name of religion and Islam. But I should make it clear that Islam is a religion of compassion and freedom, and reject fanatism, dogmatism, and dictatorship.
همچنان که کنگرسومن خانم جکسون اشاره کرد
As Congresswoman Jackson Lee you mentioned, we believe in the separation of religion and state.
ما به برداشت بردبار و
We
دموکراتیک از اسلام معتقدیم.
advocate a tolerant and democratic interpretation
اسلام حقیقیه.
of Islam, which is the genuine Islam.
ما معتقد به
And we
رأی عمومی
believe
هستیم
that
و
it is the
خواهان جدایی
vote of the people that will count.
از نظر اسلام زن
In
مرد برابرن.
our view, there's gender equality, men and women, while you know that fundamentalists are misogynists.
و هر چیزی که
And whatever which is based on compulsion is contrary to Islamic teaching.
نه دین اجباری، نه عبادت.
Whether it is no compulsion in religion, in what clothes you wear, and how you think.
به قول قرآن
And as
اکراه فی الدین.
Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion.
حاکمیت رو بزرگترین حق مردم
So sovereignty and the vote of people is the...
مشورت.
خیلی متشکرم. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to make these very brief because I know our time has ended. I just simply know that in the 1979 revolution, the Iranian intellectuals called for democracy and human rights. You just mentioned Islamic fundamentalism, which Iran seems to be the epicenter of, and therefore promoting terrorism. You might want to comment how you think this happened to Iran, and then maybe the top challenges that we must face. If we identify ISIL as an enemy, what are the challenges that relate to freedom, democracy, peace, and security that we all want to see? Let me finish by saying that if you have any comments about Camp Liberty and those continued attacks, if you want to include that as to how we can work to better stop that. And I would appreciate the Chairman's indulgence, and I thank you very much for your answers to these questions.
من باید به شما بگم که مردم ایران دموکراسی
You are
میخواستن.
absolutely right. The people of Iran wanted freedom and democracy from the revolution, and they continue to yearn for freedom and democracy. But unfortunately, Khomeini stole, grabbed the leadership of the revolution, which was for freedom and democracy,
و در واقع یک حکومت
and
بنیادگر
imposed a fundamentalist regime which by eliminating all freedom and eliminating all political forces from the Iranian society, particularly women and the youth, and established his rule.
و الان در واقع 37 ساله که
And
یک
for the past
حکومت
37 years, a fundamentalist government has been in power in Tehran.
و میدونیم که البته این حکومت پایه‌هاش بر صدور بنیادگرایی و تروری.
This regime is based on two pillars: export of terrorism and fundamentalism outside, and domestic repression.
و به دست آوردن در واقع
And at the same time trying to acquire nuclear weapons in order to take hostage the international community for doing nothing against these atrocities. These are the bases or the pillars of this regime. In the month of April, just in this month, nearly 150 executions have been announced in Iran. These are the so only by absolute repression they are maintaining the power.
ولی
But
در مقابلش یک در واقع یک مقاومت سازمان یافته.
On the other hand, there is an organized resistance have been resisting this fundamentalist regime for the past 37 years and has been able to expose the fundamentalism and terrorism of this regime and to show the world
بنیادگرایی و تروریسم.
Who is the epicenter of fundamentalism in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen and other parts of the world?
و نشون بده که
and to show that where are the secret sites of the nuclear secret sites of the mullahs are operating
مشغول کار بودن
and they have been operating
و چگونه نقض حقوق بشر مستمر
and also to inform the world about the human rights violations in Iraq.
مطمئنم که مردم ایران هم به کمک مقاومت
ایران I'm absolutely confident that the people of Iran and the Iranian resistance will bring an end and overthrow this mullah's regime and bring freedom and democracy for the people of Iran and for the people of the whole region.
و در مورد
and just very briefly about liberty. As I said, we expect that the United States government will uphold its obligations, which has been violated by now, and the U.S. government must really put Camp Liberty under its own protection zone and to put an end to the blockade, to demand from the Iraqi government to lift the blockade and to recognize their rights as a protected person under the Fourth Geneva Conventions. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back her time.
Gentlelady yields back the time. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the members of the committee and guests of the committee for being here today. This has been a very insightful hearing, and the witnesses have presented three different perspectives of the problem of ISIS, starting with Ambassador Ford succinctly analyzing that they are driven by doctrine and they're driven by the philosophy that compromise is a sin. And Dr. Ferris, you brought in your expertise to say and show that this isn't just a philosophy that's against Christians and Jews, but it's a philosophy that also attacks Muslims to a great deal, maybe more Muslims than other groups. And Mrs. Rajavi, I want to thank you as well, bringing a perspective from an Iranian point of view that is not the official mullah point of view of the government of Iran, having your expertise and seeing firsthand the results of oppression in Iran and the oppression of ISIS. And thank you as well, especially this late time in the evening. I guess it's about 11:30 or 11:45, wherever, somewhere in there. But I do, and also want to thank all of the people in the audience that shown a great interest in this hearing. So this subcommittee is adjourned, and there'll be follow-up questions that can be submitted by members of the subcommittee to all of the witnesses that have testified. Thank you.
I would like to once again thank you for organizing this hearing. Your solidarity with the Iranian people and their desire for freedom and democracy, and your efforts on behalf of the residents of Camp Liberty, much to the detriment of religious fascism ruling Iran, is laying the seeds for a new chapter in the relation between our two nations. The mullahs regime, the mullahs ruling in Iran, do not represent the Iranian people, and it is time for the international community to reject mullahs regime and side with the Iranian people and resistance to establish democracy in Iran. Regime change in Iran by the Iranian people and resistance is the beginning of the end of Islamic fundamentalism. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Thank you.